I'll just go ahead and start then. In accordance with our accessible practices, as you can see already, we'd like to challenge the need for silence and stillness in a professional or academic public environment. So we invite you to please move and speak and position yourselves in the way that's most comfortable for you throughout this presentation. Um, Image descriptions will be given as we go along, and links for further information will be dropped into the chat as we go. And then we will also provide an outline of our talk today so that everyone knows what's happening when. And to do so, I will turn it over to Hannah.
Hi, everyone. We will begin with brief introductions, and then we will be talking about the lab and kind of its general function. And then we will be going into kind of our own projects, including Crip Ritual, Remote Access Archive, and the Critical Access Primer, where Kelsie, Jarah, and I will all speak about our experience with these projects. To introduce myself, my name is Hannah Wong. I am a graduate student at the Harvard Graduate School of Design and the project manager at Critical Design Lab of the Critical Access Primer. I am a short Asian American woman with white hair, cropped in a short bob. Jarah?
Hi, I'm Jarah Moesch, and I am a white person with brown hair. Currently, I am wearing green and gold glasses. You cannot see me, but in the photo, I am wearing a project that one of my students created, which is has an Arduino and a few cables coming out of it. I am an artist, designer, scholar whose work explores issues of justice through design of embodied knowledges. And I hold an MFA in integrated media art from Hunter College and a PhD in American Studies from the University of Maryland. Kelsie?
Hi, I'm Kelsie Acton, she, her. I am a white woman with long brown hair, very curly, and today I'm wearing a two-toned blue jumpsuit. In the photo, though, my hair is shorter, and you can also see my adorable cat, Finn, who is a tuxedo. I completed my PhD in 2020. I was our department's first Zoom defense. And as of 6 weeks ago, I'm a postdoctoral researcher at York St. John University at the Institute for Social Justice. Back to you guys.
Hi, this is Jarah speaking again. So I'll give a little bit of background on the Critical Design Lab, who we are and what we do. And so we are a multidisciplinary arts and design disability culture collaborative. As queer, disabled, sick, and neurodivergent designers, we combine a commitment to disability justice with the aesthetics of accessibility and interdependence. We work in the tradition of disabled cultural producers, and our methods include public and social contestation, intimate community, and mutual aid. We pursue more accessible futures by combining disability justice with the methods of critical design, experimental media, social practice, and we challenge assumptions about accessibility and participation embedded in current media. Through our disability culture-centered media and events, we practice accessibility as creative, world-changing phenomenon that interrogates white and non-disabled design and media. To do so, we create open access participation protocols and curate experiences of access making in which collaboration itself is an artistic practice. All of our work, as you heard earlier, even before the pandemic, has been remote and digital. I've never met anybody at the Critical Design Lab in person, only virtually. This has allowed us over 8+ years of partnership to create media and projects such as the Remote Access Party, which is a curated dance party that showcases disability cultures of participatory visual arts, music and image description, and American Sign Language interpretation. Contro, which was a podcast on disability and design that reimagines podcasting itself through accessible content and form. Mapping Access, a social practice project using digital mapping to imagine accessible futures, and 3 more that we'll talk about today, including Crip Ritual, which I will discuss shortly, the Remote Access Archive, and the Critical Access Primer. Our work has been featured on numerous panels and academic conferences in media outlets such as the New York Times and Art in America, and has fostered additional collaborations with the Allied Media Project, Disability Arts New York City, and other organizations. In 2022, we were awarded a United States Artist Fellowship in Media to support this work. We have also been supported by the Mellon Foundation, the National Humanities Alliance, the Social Science Research Council, and other funding agencies. Let's see if I can turn slide. Yeah, can somebody, thank you, perfect. So our work focuses on the idea of protocol, which we understand as a tool for bringing one another into the middle of a practice that in order to generate more critical questions. When we look at existing protocols, what we find is that in design, a protocol is a procedure for guiding a practice of world building, whereas cultural protocols are about making explicit what we consider ethical or right actions. And institutional forms of accessibility checklists represent access as a finished project. You check items off a list and then you're done. Now, contrast this with our accessibility protocol, which is a guide for replicating an experiment in access. And in our case, our protocols are based on existing disability culture protocols. I've grabbed a screenshot from our protocols page on our website. And so this image is a website with black text on a white background. It is labeled Critical Design Lab Protocol Index and has 3 subcategories for the protocols that the Critical Design Lab has focused on. Protocols for designing otherwise, protocols for creating accessible spaces, and protocols for disability justice-centered teaching. These all have links to individual protocols that fit these descriptions. And I invite you to read these when you have some time, and I'll post a link in the chat when I'm done speaking so I don't get thrown off here again. Next slide, please. Thank you. And so now I'll turn to Crip Ritual. I'll start out by giving a bit of an introduction to the exhibition, and then I'll discuss a few components that are directly related to the ideas of community and culture at a distance. This was a really large project and it took form over a 4-year period. So obviously I'll just be giving a few highlights, but I'm happy to answer any questions you may have afterwards. So Crip Ritual was an exhibition of about 25 disabled artists. It showed at 2 galleries in Toronto between February and April of 2022. The work spanned many media, including painting, drawing, sculpture, installation, and performance, all of them focused on the concept of ritual from a disability perspective. The exhibition was curated by 3 members of the Critical Design Lab, Cassandra Hartley, Amy Hamrai, and myself. The exhibition and the programming were supported by numerous places, University of Toronto, Scarborough, Toronto Arts Council, the Ontario Arts Council, the Canada Council for the Arts, Bodies in Translation, and the Canadian Heritage Canada Arts Presentation Fund. The image on this slide is the installation view of works by Sky Cubba at Dar's McCarthy Gallery. And the photograph, along with all the other gallery photographs, were done by Michelle Peak Photography. And so what is on the screen right now is a white and bright pink colored wall, 3 colorful clothing garments, a colorful metal chain, a pink colored mannequin head, a TV screen, and a pair of wired headphones all hang from the wall. Next slide, please. So we collaborated on this exhibition with 2 galleries, the Dar's McCarthy Gallery at the University of Toronto Scarborough and Tangled Art and Disability. And so the images that you are seeing on the left is the interior of Tangled Art and Disability Gallery. It's part of the Crip Ritual exhibition. It has a view of 5 artworks displayed in a gallery with white walls, a wood floor, and a loft ceiling. The sidewalls hold a series of drawings arranged in grids and a series of 6 matted and framed photos. The back wall has 2 different works, one installation with multiple elements, and you can see a curtain in front of it, and there's a pink light behind. and another has a table and video showing a person's head and shoulders. There is a fiber work that is hanging from the ceiling and sitting on a plinth in the center of the room. On the right is the interior of the Doris McCarthy Gallery, and the back wall has the same curvy pink shape on it, and that's the same one that was on the earlier slide. And then there's a blue bench with writing on the center that says, "Museum visits are hard on my body." And on the left, there are a series of paintings, and on the right, a bunch of framed images. Next slide, please. So the curatorial process for this, including how we came up with the phrase crip ritual, is so we built accessibility into the process from the beginning as a generative part of this creative process. And so thinking about the idea that we couldn't do anything with this exhibition without really grounding what it means to be accessible into the core of the work. And so we started with the title of the show, Crip Ritual. The word crip is a reclaimed form of the word cripple that some disabled people use to describe their own identity or community, often in response to social imperatives to be normal, productive, or able-bodied. And rituals are practices that transform and draw together social worlds. So therefore, crip ritual describes the things that disabled people do to create new possibilities and realities. This exhibition gathered together artworks that use ritual to foreground understandings of disabled, crip, deaf, mad, and sick people's experiences. And so the idea was to highlight strategies for building crip power, ceremonies, habits, celebrations, design practices, social scripts, community agreements grounded in disabled knowledge and experience that undergird disability culture. Once we determined the details for this project, the call for art went out online with this description in multiple formats. And so the image on this slide is an image of the exhibition statement on the wall of the gallery with a video of ASL interpretation. And if you'd like to see the ASL interpretation, you can find it on our project website. And again, I'll post links in the chat shortly. Next slide, please. So in terms of access and collaboration, we also, for the call itself, the call went out in ASL and simple English, and this was to ensure that as many disabled artists as possible could have access to submit work. And these calls went out across all of our social media channels. Additionally, we offered in-person submissions, live ASL translation, and other methods for people to submit their art as needed. And then as the pandemic arrived and changed everything, the exhibition and related events were continually shifting in order to adapt to the pandemic circumstances, which required us to rethink how we would approach both virtual and remote access options. And so we did so through creating disability-led protocols and innovations, including moving in-person workshops online, creating live virtual tours of each gallery, an online archive, live virtual events, and a physical care package. Next slide, please. So as part of the preparations for the exhibition, the selected artists were invited to a collaborative workshop run by the Design Lab to develop accessibility elements for their artwork. This was initially supposed to be in person. However, with the start of the pandemic, we moved to an online format with breakout rooms for the artists and curators to work together. The idea was to take access rituals further, to enable participating artists to explore possibilities for adding access elements to their works. So in addition to standard near objective image descriptions, we offered the idea of using these access elements to generate new creative elements that contribute to the overall aesthetic of the work. We asked that artists create or work with our team to make work accessible to the audiences through a wide variety of sensory experiences, image or video description, tactile options to touch a work, things like that. One example of an artist who really ran with this prompt is Lena Raudvi, who you see on the screen. She originally submitted a single video, which through working with us in the workshop, she ended up adding multiple tactile expressions of sound and a spoken word poem. And to describe the images, there are two black and white images side by side on a split screen. In the image on the left, we are looking upwards at a ceiling of a big white room with a white column on the left. A woman in dark clothing is leaning over a metal stool. She is on her knees with one arm reaching to the floor, and the other arm is folded under her chest. The end of a walking stick is visible on the floor to the right. In the image on the right, a woman with short hair and glasses is wearing a dark shirt and is lying awkwardly on the top of a metal stool. She has one arm folded under her chest and the other is reaching down. Her head is leaning over the edge of the stool, facing down. Her body fills most of the picture frame. And so these are two stills from her video that she had originally put in, submitted, and then there are layers of sound. There was a chair that one could sit on with some vibration and motor objects that you could also use in another chair as well, or while standing. So she really took it she added about 4 elements in the end to her project after that workshop. Next slide, please. So we also have a website, which was an essential piece of remote access for audiences who couldn't visit the gallery, obviously in the context for the pandemic and for those with heightened immune risk, but first and foremost, because disability culture means always including remote access options. So there was always going to be a website. How it developed changed a bit due to the pandemic, but it was always going to be there. And so it has multiple purposes. First, as I mentioned, a virtual asynchronous way to engage in the exhibit, but also as an access element and as documentation. Specifically, it has all of the artwork and background information, the activisms and theories that ground the work, and the ability to explore the ceremonial practices, vernacular designs, and the transformative strategies through which disability culture makes crip life livable. It is still live and viewable and has quite a bit of regular traffic. The image in front of you is the homepage of the website at cripritual.com. It has the word hashtag crip ritual at the top with images and text describing the exhibition. Next slide, please. So we held 5 virtual artist panels and 2 workshops while the exhibition was in the galleries. To do so, we developed and used protocols for accessible panels, from how to ask artists to join the panels themselves in the ways that felt best to them. We had preparation for talks and workshops. We resolved conflicting access needs. And then there were scripts for the day of that were made available to the panelists and to the attendees. And of course, ASL captioning and other access processes. On the screen is a list of panel and workshop titles. You can read more about these on our website as well. Next slide, please. Both galleries ran virtual tours throughout the exhibition period. Tours ran for about 30 minutes and were with gallery staff. You were able to sign up online ahead of time for them. And so the image in front of you is of Tangled Gallery. There is a person with a pair of headphones and an iPad on a stand in front of them. And then the back wall has 6 framed photographs. And so Tangled set up this iPad on wheels and used that to guide virtual attendees around to view the artwork. They were able to see the works up close and to ask questions as they moved through the space. Next slide, please. And then finally, the last thing I'll mention today is the care package. Anyone who came to a virtual or in-person tour received a care package. We mailed them to people who attended virtually, and there's also a virtual one available on our website. This care package began as a conversation between the Critical Design Lab curators and the gallery folks at both galleries. Our thoughts began with the idea of contact, the extraordinary contact that we have when we encounter art in a gallery with other people. We then considered the connections between crip ritual and the idea of disabled mutual aid, and how we sustain each other, how we create and continue connections between people who are physically far apart. So some of the questions we asked were, how might we make deeper connections with remote gallery goers across the world? What is the crip ritual of disabled, crip, deaf, mad, sick virtual connection? What is necessary for sustaining life, and how do crip rituals sustain us and build community? And not sustaining in terms of physicality only, but also as collective liberation of living beautiful, disabled, mad, crip, deaf, sick lives. When art, poetry, and song are understood as collective necessities for life, we can change the world we live in. And so I began to wonder what a mutual aid expression of the crip ritual of connection would look like. How might we make these connections to those who join us for virtual tours, who come to remote artist talks, or arrive on the crip ritual website? What does contact even mean? What does it mean to be fully present in the moment when we are alone in our rooms, as I am right now, yet together through screens? And so we chose to create these care packages as our answer. And so I'm going to just read a small bit from the letter that I wrote that's at the beginning of the package when it's first opened. To my friend I have not yet met, this letter announces and affirms my love and care for you, my fellow disabled person, my crip, deaf, mad, and sick family. This is my ritual of crip love, to unconditionally love every bit of your beautiful body-mind, to care for your heart, your mind, your well-being through this letter and the objects it arrived with. Words, texture, images, things that can be held and used. Contact. In these times, and in all times, when the world prefers us dead, an accessible loss for a return to a normal that never worked for us to begin with, here we are. A cause for celebration, imagining, creating valuable disabled presents and futures. My words descend from a legacy of ritual letter writing, of activist zines, of art, of mutual aid, of sustaining each other, of creating and continuing connections between people who are physically far apart, some of us isolated from other body minds, from touch. This is for you. Through the action of sharing these words, these objects, we engage in a mutual aid of sustenance, of initial connection, of potential collective futures. We have always been in the interstices, liminal. Out there just became another level of danger, one more layer of risk than was there before. And we care for each other through sharing masks, money, food, life hacks, a place to sit, putting ourselves in places and spaces as refusal and protest. These are community care. Community care is crip ritual. And I'll stop there and pass it along. Thank you.
The Remote Access Archive, a screenshot of a Zoom shared screen which shows a work of art by Yo-Yo Lin. The art is gray and white, a blob against a black background. The top of the screen names a Zoom meeting. The bottom shows a series of gray buttons along with an orange chat button that is lit up. A speech bubble above it, from Dominica to everyone, says, yes, same issue with the audio. So in this section, I'm going to introduce you to the Remote Access Archive, which is one of CDL's current projects. Can I get the next slide, please? So, the project is, the primary investigator is Dr. Amy Hamrai. I'm the project manager. And it gathers stories, documents, and other information about how disabled people have used technology to interact and create community and culture at a distance, both before and during the COVID-19 pandemic. This approach is deliberately extraordinarily wide. And we're currently funded by the Social Science Research Council and the National Science Foundation. Next slide, please. So why an archive? Remember how, for a minute, so many forms of access disabled people had long fought for were here because disabled people needed them. Remember virtual work, pandemic pay for frontline workers, online schools, online events with captioning and ASL, teaching people how to freaking wash their hands and stay home when they are sick, the ability to reschedule an appointment or a plane ticket when you got sick and not get yelled at or charged a fee, and in immunocompromised shopping hours. We, as disabled revolutionaries, are disabled memory keepers, and our refusal to forget both our dead and the work of our survival is part of our revolutionary work. That's Leah Lakshay, Pibranza Samhara Sinha from Truth Out. So, if refusing to forget is revolutionary, then documenting and passing on our stories is also revolutionary work. We document the ways disabled people have created connection and community at a distance, organized care and protest, and continue to resist the non-disabled world's refusal to acknowledge our cultures and continued existence. One of the other things that has become obvious in the last year of data collection, because we've just finished our first year, is that this archive is also documenting crip technoscience. So Hamrai describes this as, quote, the work that disabled people do to redesign the material world, often with the political intention to contest compulsory able-bodiedness, militarism, and capitalism, end quote. As Hamrai and Fitch note, disabled people are not just consumers of technology, but active and creative in its use. And this ingenuity, particularly in using digital or virtual platforms, tools and spaces to create access, culture, and community, is part of what we're looking at. Next slide, please. So currently, the archive is organized around 4 key questions. We're asking, how did disabled people use remote access before the COVID-19 pandemic? How do we use remote access now, during the continued COVID-19 pandemic? What are the consequences of denying requests for remote access? And then finally, what access frictions and clashes are inherent to remote access? Next slide, please. Right now, we've collected 375 individual entries into the archive. The numbers are a little different on the screen. I'm showing a graph here, or a table here that breaks down the type of entries we have into categories like oral histories, self-submitted interviews, images, newsletters, and so on. Because, for example, most of our newsletters include now the entire archives of the post-polio news and ventilator-assisted living, and we currently have received 44 pictures documenting the UCLA remote access, hybrid access strike. There's, of course, some blurriness. We're making up and refining categories as we take items into the archive. Next slide, please. And so here's just a few of the things that we were looking for when we began our call-outs. We were and still are looking for evidence of how people used phone trees to organize care, or have connected through Zoom, as we are today, Google Meet, and through online video conferencing platforms. We wanted to know about remote stenography and ASL and the complications of those. And we're also interested in how print culture could function as remote access. So letters, newsletters, and so on. Next slide, please. So in the first phase of the project, we did outreach through social media. We also really quickly realized that we were going to need to go to our networks and do personal asks, because overall this has been the most successful way of bringing items into the archives. So in fall 2020, when we were starting this phase of the work,
We brainstormed an enormous list of people and organizations and just started emailing. Inevitably, this means that the archive currently reflects our own networks. So there's just like a lot of queer disabled people from North America in this archive right now. I'm going to shift here and talk just a little bit about some of the things that I've been curious about as we've started to bring in documents into the archive. This is not a comprehensive list or a real analysis, just a few things I'm interested in. So on the screen is the opening pages of Hannah Sullivan Facknitz and Daniel Loren's Cripping Pandemic Learning in Higher Education, a guide. And you can see that the writing chronicles a series of updates since the guide was originally published. So for me, one of the striking things about the first few months of the COVID-19 pandemic was how many access guides were produced by disabled people. So if crip technoscience is the work that we do to redesign the material world, I think there's a tendency to think of this redesign as happening around the physical. Disabled people build ramps. They turn shower chairs into transfer boards. But behavioral redesigns, so our protocols, are also really important. And in the first year of the pandemic, disabled people were putting out endless guides, like this one, about how to make virtual spaces, from meetings to schooling to work, accessible. None of these guides suggested changes to the infrastructure of Zoom or to any other virtual platform, although that did come eventually. But it was disabled people sharing their wisdom about how to alter your online practices so that more people could work, learn, and socialize online. This generosity welcomed non-disabled people into disabled people's remote worlds. Next slide, please. So here we have an iconic moment from Disability Twitter. Daniel Lawson writes, "Disabled parking should only be valid during business hours, 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. I cannot see why any people with genuine disabilities would be out during that time." And Jennifer Lee Rossman replies, "We're disabled, Daniel, we're not werewolves." So Hassan suggests that we think of simultaneity or synchronicity as being the defining feature of time in our networked digital world. One of the things I was really surprised by as we began to take in items into the archive was how early synchronous remote access emerged. So for example, the Toomey Gazette, a newsletter dedicated to sharing and connecting polio survivors around the world, details instances of intercom schooling, where students were connected to their classrooms by telephone. I conducted an oral history with a blind activist and podcaster about how blind communities were early adopters of conference calling because it meant they could organize without the hassle of trying to meet out in the inaccessible world outside their homes. And then also heard very similar stories from an activist involved in the early years of HIV organizing about the importance that conference calling had connecting activist groups across the United States. Conversely, Hassan points out that asynchronous communications and knowledge production is also an important feature of the networked world. Asynchronous remote access can be seen through Twitter and other social media platforms, and online disability exhibits and writing, such as Crip Ritual. From the archive, I've learned that we deeply need both synchronous and asynchronous connections to find ourselves, each other, and to build community. One of our oral history interviewees talks very specifically about how the disability newsletter and literary magazine, The Ragged Edge, which began publication in the 1980s, was vital to allow him to form a sense of his disabled identity. He speaks about living in Berkeley, a site of disabled activism in the 80s, and walking back and forth in front of the entrance to the Berkeley Center for Independent Living, coming up with reason after reason not to enter. But remote, asynchronous access through other disabled people's stories allowed him to embrace his disabled identity. And then I did another oral history interview with someone saying something very similar about Tumblr in the early 2010s, about how it brought them into autistic and trans identity and community. And in particular, they wanted to note that the way Tumblr allows you to have a stable but anonymous identity with a recorded history is this amazing way of allowing people to cultivate and understand and make identity a space of play. As crip technoscience suggests, part of disability culture is the joyous hacking and repurposing of the material and digital worlds to create ease or access, culture, and community. Disability Twitter, as exemplified here, is not unique. Disabled people have always used whatever technology we could find or build to locate each other, to share knowledge, to memorialize our dead, survive better, and of course, make fun of ableist assholes. And the Remote Access Archive documents all of this. I'll hand it over to Hannah now.
Thanks, Kelsie. This is Hannah speaking. Again, I'm the project manager of the Critical Access Primer at the Critical Design Lab. On the screen are the words Critical Access Primer in bright orange on a background with squiggles. This project was started by Dr. Amy Hamrai and has been through several iterations of the lab, which is currently being worked on by Julia Karpix, Chris Ingman, Kate Hall, and myself. The Critical Access Primer is an educational project by the Critical Design Lab exploring the emerging vocabularies of critical access. The primer examines terms and phrases from disability culture and how they can inform new directions for design practice. Presented as a multimedia toolkit, the primer is meant as a resource for design students, faculty, practitioners, and anyone who wants to understand critical disability and access studies. So what the primer really aims to do is to connect people who may not have traditional access to critical access studies with scholarship, particularly from disabled, chronically ill, or neurodivergent people and scholars. Here I have displayed on a background a word cloud of some of the terms that we are using in the Critical Access Primer. The types of critical access terms we use include universal design, spoon theory, techno-ableism, retrofit, radical access, access is love, disability admin, access intimacy, collective access, crip technoscience, access fatigue, and the design theory of disability. While we understand the importance of a historical approach to disability studies, we're primarily rooted in the current studies of critical access and are constantly exploring new publications for emerging vocabularies. Now I will take us through one of the critical access terms and how it is presented. In this case, we are using access intimacy. The word access intimacy is displayed in a large font on a dark background with a search bar and drop down beneath it. It's under the words Critical Access Primer and is labeled as the second term. One of the ways in which we are disseminating information in the Critical Access Primer is through social media posts. And so I will take us through each slide in what may be an Instagram carousel. Each critical access term is represented by a search, as if one was Googling the term. The drop-down menu displays each of the ways in which we explore the term in Critical Access Primer, including the definition, commentary, examples, and a podcast. Next in the carousel is the definition. On the screen is access intimacy again in bold font with a dictionary entry of the term below. The slide reads, access intimacy, noun, coined by Mia Mingus in 2011. Access intimacy refers to the sense of comfort experienced by an individual when their access needs are understood by another person. Although the term may often be applied in describing the experiences of disabled people, access intimacy can be encountered by anyone. Access intimacy can be experienced with and from strangers, as well as in relationships that have been built over time, with people who have had a significant political awareness of ableism and access, or those who have not yet developed this awareness. It's first important that we establish this definition, especially coming from the lens of our disabled scholars, to kind of foreground what the term means in modern context. The next slide is an excerpt from a blog post written by members of the lab. The blog post proposes the definition and some personal commentary on the critical access term. The slide shows how an access intimacy in bold font, and below is a quote by Harsha Balusubramanian, which states, Mingus's contribution to conceptualizing access intimacy offers an important departure from the view of access's successful, smooth removal of barriers. This view risks overlooking the labor required for access to emerge, as well as the many frictions and negotiations that can arise in the process of producing access. Some of these conflicts can be generated in the difference between access needs of people identifying with the same disability. Again, it's really important for us to highlight the work of disabled, neurodivergent, and chronically ill scholars and their own relationships to the critical access terms. We then provide examples of the term. The slide shows access intimacy in bold font and has a quote underneath by Mia Mingus stating examples of access intimacy. Her examples include relationships where I always feel I can say what my access needs are, no matter what, or I can say that I don't know them, and that's okay too. People not expecting payment in the form of emotional currency or ownership for access, able-bodied people listening to me and believing me, people investing in remembering my access needs and checking in with me if there are going to be situations that might be inaccessible or hard disability body-wise, someone just sitting and holding your hand while you both stare back at an inaccessible world. Then for each term, we record a podcast. These are usually in the form of a group discussion or interview. The slide reads Contra podcast, Critical Access Primer 2, Critical Access Intimacy. Harsha Balusubramanian provides a brief summary and commentary of access intimacy and discusses the term with other members of the Critical Design Lab. Most of the terms that we use are discussed in a way that reflects our own personal experiences with the term or how we might relate to the term, and provides a personal context for the term in its modern society. And for completion, here is the last slide in the carousel with the project description that I read earlier. The Critical Access Primer primarily functions as an educational tool, although it is not yet published. We hope to incorporate it into a summer school where we're inviting scholars who may have some familiarity with disability studies and the historical context of disability studies to come and learn about these newer kind of modern critical access terms and what it means in the context of design. And we are primarily using these terms as drivers for ways in which people can explore design and its functionality with accessibility and critical access in mind. Thank you.
And that's everything from us. Thank you so much to all of you for having us. And also thank you to Jarah and Hannah for joining me extremely early from North America.